So it turns out the past few weeks have been a time of introspection and reflection for me. Since I had my epiphany about Captain Marvel, not only have I had a chance to reconsider all kinds of movies and TV shows that I previously never saw an issue with, but I've also decided to turn my critical eye on another great passion of mine. No, I'm talking about video games. Now, there's been a lot of fair and impartial analysis done on the video game industry in recent years by well-informed, highly qualified researchers who really believe in what they're doing, and more importantly, the kind of people who've been passionate about video games their whole lives.
I'm not a fan of video games. I actually had to learn a lot about video games in the process of making this.
So they're particularly well placed to offer their opinions on the state of the industry, and the one thing they keep highlighting is the problem of representation and diversity in games. As they so rightly stated, every important character in video games is just the same straight white male, so generic it's like they rolled off a factory assembly line. It's almost like no other genders, races, sexual orientations, or even species are allowed to exist in this space, and it's really quite tragic for all of us. Now, I have to admit, before I got my brain right, I used to think of such critics as pompous, poorly informed, attention-hungry, self-important morons, with no understanding of video games, the people who play them, or the culture that surrounds them, and whose only actual talent was identifying popular bandwagons they could leap on and ride all the way to fame, money, and success. Kind of ironic when you think about it, really. But anyway, I was wrong to think that way. And looking back over the history of representation in video games through an intersectional, interdenominational, interdimensional postmodern lens, I've had a chance to expose my own biases and privileges in order to become a better man. And I want to help make you better too. Much like with movies, the problems began in my childhood with the games I was exposed to from an early age, which were so steeped in hypermasculinity that you could distill them down into pill form and use them as a cure for men with low testosterone levels. Science fiction adventure games, for example, were exclusively male domains with not a single strong or interesting female character in sight. I mean, really, the idea of a woman battling dangerous aliens with an increasingly powerful arsenal of futuristic weapons was just crazy back then. Fantasy was no better. The female characters there were nothing but helpless damsels in distress waiting for you to come and rescue them, and they certainly never took centre stage as playable characters, wrestling with forces that could change the entire future of their worlds. And as for beat-em-up games, forget it. There's no way women would be allowed to even take part in such violent contests against their far stronger and more powerful male counterparts. Never mind actually defeat them, that's just crazy. What's wrong with you? Things were even worse once you got into the 32-bit era, where women were treated as nothing more than over-sexualized objects for male players to fawn over. They were certainly never portrayed as competent and resourceful authority figures, highly effective special forces operatives, tough brawlers that could take on enemies many times larger than themselves, or seasoned explorers who would venture alone into dark, dangerous underground caverns of the world in search of hidden artifacts. No, the 1990s was a dark time indeed for female gamers. Even in the early 2000s, gaming still hadn't caught up with the rest of the world. For example, we'd yet to experience a decent survival horror game that put a woman into a lead role. The Resident Evil series in particular was guilty of this total lack of representation. Not a single woman to be found anywhere, never mind racially diverse women. The Metal Gear Solid series was another total embarrassment. With its inept female supporting characters, you were forced to babysit through difficult sections, who never pulled their own weight or did anything remotely useful. And even on the rare occasions when the games wheeled out a female antagonist for you to fight, they were always treated as complete pushovers that you could breeze past in seconds. It's like they were trying to say, see, women just can't do stuff like this. Really, Konami ought to be ashamed of what they created here. Fantasy adventure games were still completely devoid of female characters, of course. Neither were there any powerful or dangerous women in thrillers, or horror games for that matter. Things were no better on the action shooter front. You never once saw a female fighting alongside the men on equal terms. It was like the gaming industry had never even heard of female soldiers before. Another issue that female characters were constantly running into was the overt sexualization that was just everywhere. They were nearly always wearing the most revealing, impractical outfits imaginable, along with ridiculously proportioned bodies that no normal woman could ever hope to measure up to. While male characters, on the other hand, were depicted as just regular guys with average, easily attainable bodies, but they were still capable of impossible feats of strength. And their physiques were certainly never shown in any kind of gratuitous way like their female counterparts. It was as if to say, men don't need to care what they look like. The balance in the way men and women were shown on screen was just appalling, and it's no wonder that female gamers had such a hard time feeling any respect or empathy towards these pointless sex objects which were being thrown at them. But Drinker, you handsome yet humble intellectual, I hear you say, it was a different time back then. The video game industry was still in its infancy, and surely it's unfair and dishonest to judge old games by modern sensibilities. Not to mention that 3D graphics back then were rudimentary at best, forcing games designers to paint their characters with broad strokes. Well, those arguments don't hold any water with me, dear viewer, because my feelings don't care about your facts. Now let's talk about the issue of race. It's another area where video games shockingly underrepresent people who aren't white and male. And on the rare occasions when they do decide to show other races, it's nearly always by resorting to tired, outdated and offensive stereotypes. The idea that you'd see a black person represented in a video game as a highly intelligent scientist, a dedicated law enforcement officer, a high-ranked veteran soldier, an eco-warrior fighting to save the entire planet, a kind-hearted and compassionate survivor in a post-apocalyptic world, or a professional anti-terrorism expert, it's just ridiculous. And black antagonists who were just as skilled and resourceful as you, with tragic backstories and fully realised character arcs? No way, never happened. Another vital part of video game characters is their sexuality, which really informs every aspect of their personality and their decision making when you think about it. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see a characters like him, her, or that, the most important question on my mind is, I wonder who they like to sleep with in their spare time. I just can't take them seriously unless I know for sure. It's a well-known fact that you really can't have an interesting, sympathetic character without knowing whether they prefer men or women or something else entirely.
Everything you've heard about me is true.
But again, the video game industry lets us down by never once showing characters who are openly gay, lesbian or bisexual. Now, before I got my brain right, I used to consider video games to be a legitimate forum for free artistic expression, largely independent of contemporary politics, and the people who reviewed them as being fair and impartial professionals who would make judgments based on their quality alone. But now I can see how wrong I was to think that way. No longer can games developers have free artistic license to create any kind of story and characters they want. We need quotas and ratios and rules and guidelines to make sure they never stray from the correct path again. We need to campaign hard and lobby games developers to force them to include more representation in their games by any means necessary. And that's also why we should support the hard work and thorough research done by people who've started exposing these social and political shortcomings in the industry. Luckily enough though, we have allies in our fight. Mainstream video game publications and journalists are now firmly behind our cause, so we can definitely rely on them to promote games with progressive agendas and characters and overlook their shortcomings. But we can't get complacent about this because there are more and more independent games review sites popping up that want to judge games purely on their own merits, and we can't have that kind of thinking taking hold. Because really, if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that we need to bring as much politics and social justice as possible into our computer-generated fantasy worlds. It's done wonders for the success of other entertainment mediums, and I'm sure it'll be just as good for our favourite hobby. Already we're seeing the positive results of our efforts, and I confidently predict this will only continue to improve as time goes by and more people join our cause. Truly, there are great days ahead for the video games industry, and I'm excited to be a part of it. And that's all I have today. Go away now.